Welcome back. Hopefully you had a chance to participate in this picture brain part activity. What I wanted you to do was to look at each picture and try to figure out which of the 11 brain parts I was trying to represent with the picture. So let's see, number one, the occipital lobe. This is a visual chart, and so we know that the occipital lobe is responsible for taking in visual information. It's your primary visual um, processing portion of the brain. Okay, let's go to number two. This is the temporal lobe, because the temporal lobe is the primary auditory cortex. So auditory information tends to be processed by the temporal lobe. So there we have an ear. Here you have a person eating, so this is the hypothalamus, because the hypothalamus has a nuclei in it responsible for controlling feeding behavior. It also has a nuclei for sexual behavior, drinking behavior, regulating body temperature. It controls the autonomic nervous system. It also controls the pituitary gland. So there's a lot of different things that the hypothalamus does. I just picked eating as one of them. Okay, here you have a person touching the light. So hopefully you connected touch. So your primary somatosensory cortex is the parietal lobe, and what it's responsible for is processing touch information. There's 4 basic types of touch: temperature, pain, deep pressure, and light pressure, all that the parietal lobe processes. Here you have a person thinking. So this is the thinker. This is the frontal lobe. Our frontal lobe is responsible for, it's our primary motor cortex, so it controls a lot of motor movement. It's the part of the cortex that controls motor movement, but it's also the place that we think is the executive of the brain, or the part of the brain that controls everything else, and that's where we do a lot of our thinking. They say that the frontal lobe is the seat of the personality, and if you remember from the research methods lecture, Phineas Gage had a rod through his frontal lobe, and from that day forward his personality changed. So the major thinker of the brain would be the frontal lobe. And in fact, we know that alcohol can shut down, can inhibit the frontal lobe. Also, stress seems to inhibit the frontal lobe, and we find that we aren't able to think as well when we're under stress nor under the influence of alcohol. Now this next one is a really tough one. I'm not sure if you would get this one, but I thought that I would add it in here because it's interesting. This one is the reticular formation, and the reason why I have this one on here is what happens during a knockout punch when someone loses attention and arousal is the reticular formation is altered. So this one you may not have gotten, but maybe you use the process of elimination. A reticular formation is responsible for arousal and attention. Okay. On this one we have a balancing act. So hopefully you know that the balancing portion of the brain that helps us to balance is the cerebellum. So the cerebellum coordinates movements, it's responsible for balance. In fact, when a police officer does a sobriety test and he asks you to walk across the line and touch your finger to your nose, basically what he's checking for is he's checking, has the alcohol reached the cerebellum? See, the first place where the alcohol goes to is it goes to the frontal lobe, and that's why we have a little bit of a personality change and our thinking isn't quite the way it was. You know, some of us become the sad drunk, and some of us become the sexual drunk, and some of us become the angry drunk. And so when we just have a little bit of alcohol, our personality alters a bit. We become more present. We're not thinking so much to the future or to the past, because the future and the past, planning, all that stuff, is more of a frontal lobe function. So when the alcohol inhibits the frontal lobe, that's why alcohol makes us kind of focused on right the present moment. Then where the alcohol travels to is the cerebellum. So the next thing to go after our personality changes is our coordination and balance. And that's what the police officer is looking for when he asks you to do a series of motor tests. if you've had enough alcohol to affect your cerebellum, you can probably get a blood alcohol content on you. Okay, we have the heart here. So hopefully you knew that the medulla controls the heart rate. So let me just go back to about alcohol and how it affects the brain. If you drink way too much, you go past where your motor coordination is inhibited, usually you have two reactions. You either have vomiting or you have blacking out. And the vomiting and the blacking out are actually life-saving mechanisms, because if you continue to drink, then the next place where the alcohol travels to is the medulla. And if alcohol reaches the medulla and inhibits it enough, that's where you get the overdose and the heart stops. Because if you inhibit the medulla controls breathing and heart rate, and that will kill you. So once the alcohol reaches an area on the pons called the area postrema, it triggers a vomiting or a blacking out. And once you're vomiting or blacking out, you won't be drinking anymore. And that's good, because if you did, it would hit the medulla. With this said, I hope to not sound like a preacher here, but the process of taking hard alcohol, hard liquor, like a bottle of Jack Daniels or a bottle of Wild Turkey or Seagram 7, Bacardi, one of the hard alcohols, and just tipping it up and drinking it as fast as you can. Sometimes parties do something like that. That's a very dangerous practice, because if you're drinking the hard alcohol that fast, you may be able to drink enough to where you've drank so much alcohol that once you black out or vomit, start maybe blacking out or maybe vomiting from the alcohol, you drink hard alcohol so quickly that it's still running through your system, and so you lay down on the couch and you never wake up. Also, when you mix alcohol with barbituates, a downer, they tend to magnify each other's effects, and so they can also inhibit the medulla. In fact, most all drug overdoses are going to come from a mixture with alcohol, a central nervous system depressant mixed with alcohol. That's the majority of drug overdoses. Okay, this one here is a difficult one again. I'm not sure if you would get it, but I thought it would give me an opportunity to teach you about it a little bit. This is the thalamus. So the reason why I chose a mailman is the thalamus, what it does is the information comes up the spinal cord and it reaches the thalamus, and then the thalamus acts kind of like a separator. It takes sensory information and it puts it to the parietal lobe, and it takes your visual information and sends it to the occipital lobe, and it sends your auditory information to the temporal lobe. So what it is I think your textbook calls it like the switchboard operator, is it kind of divides out all the information that's traveling up the spinal cord and sends it to the right area of the brain. So another way of thinking of it is like the mailman. All the letters, all the information come into the post office, and then the mailman sorts them. So I'm not sure if you got that, but that's another analogy to help you remember the thalamus. Okay, this one seems to me a little bit easy. This is the hippocampus. So of course you learned from the memory lecture that our hippocampus is the area of the brain that is responsible for memory, and that's what this picture is showing, the memory that's in your head. The hippocampus is the organizer of memory. Here we had a guy jumping up and down, what I thought was like frustration, and then you have a guy that's kind of blushing. He could be blushing because he's in love, or he could be blushing because he's anxious. We don't know why, but most of our emotional center of the brain is the amygdala, and so the amygdala has different clusters of cells in it for bonding behavior or love behavior, and for aggression and for anxiety. So our emotional center is the amygdala. Okay, hopefully you've were able to accomplish all the objectives for this module, and we'll start next week with module 5, and it will be on stress and health.